The Industrial Revolution, a radical change in everything. Now, we spent the last class period talking extensively about what it was like before the Industrial Revolution. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to show you what the Industrial Revolution was, or at least how it began. So, it started in England. Now, the question that historians have asked numerous times is, why did it start in Britain? And their answer generally is they had a lot of things that the Industrial Revolution needs, like you need a stable government with input from the wealthy classes, as in the wealthy classes kind of control it. Remember we mentioned in the Commercial Revolution that merchants rule thing? Well, money is definitely still power, and money finds its way during this time period into producing more and more complicated objects, that idea of industrializing. So in England, they also had a benefit of wars mostly taking place overseas, unless they were civil wars, which, I mean, happened a number of times. But mostly, the kinds of devastating continental wars that the rest of Europe saw were not taking place in England at the time of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So England also had a lot of natural resources like coal and iron, both of those coming out of the ground. Rivers, which at this time were incredibly important because before railroads, rivers were really the main avenues of transportation of the Industrial Revolution. You could use canals to connect major waterways. You could then have barges that were eventually powered by steam to carry really heavy stuff. Essentially, it was, in a lot of cases, a tenth or a hundredth of the price to transport something by water than it was to transport it by, honestly, mule or other human being. England also had a lot of colonies, and those colonies were full of timber and slaves and sugar and a lot of other goods that were perfect precursors to the finished goods that England would then ship back out and sell. Precursors meaning the things that make up a more complicated object or an object that comes later, a precursor. So England also had a relatively large labor force, because they had had a really extensive revision of the way they did farming, and they had the steam engine as an early invention because they had a lot of coal, and because they needed to mine more coal, they needed to pump water out of the mines, because if you dig far enough down, water starts to fill in the mine, so they needed to pump that out. They got the steam engine, and it was pretty sweet, because it used coal from the mines to pump more water out of the mines, which meant you could get more coal, which meant you could then pump more water out. It was a virtuous, and by virtuous I mean damaging to the environment, but virtuous cycle. So how it spread. Basically, Britain started out in the Industrial Revolution, and then as they became more and more industrialized and gained a lot of power as a result, other European countries saw that model that England had and tried to replicate it. And that worked to more or less, better or worse in different countries, depending on what sorts of resources they had and their kinds of governments and whether they had access to the waterways like England had. The United States in particular was really lucky. We have waterways that work just like that, especially like around Pittsburgh, up through the Great Lakes, where we had this combination of iron ore in the ground, coal in the ground, and also waterways to transport all that heavy stuff. So take a look at when this happened. This is specifically Europe, but the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, as in like where it started, was in the United Kingdom. You can see the industrial areas there. Those are these little white regions. I know that's hard to see on the map, but the little white regions all over this map are industrial areas. And what you would see if you looked at a map of natural resources of those areas, they either have coal, as in around Lancaster and down here in this area, and also in the Alsace and Lorraine and the Ruhr area. They have coal or iron, and then especially in some of these areas, there's a lot of access to rivers, and there's rivers running about this way in Germany, and this way in Germany, this way in France, and all the way through the United Kingdom. So, France, Germany, this whole area right here was industrialized by the mid-1800s. And then it continued to spread as other countries picked up on this idea and began to see the benefits of using machines and industry and this coal power and steam power to run their industry. It spread out this way. You can see it actually sort of spreading geographically like this. But what's interesting is that Spain, the Ottoman Empire that controlled all of these modern day countries right there, um, they didn't pick up on this even by the late 1800s. And you can imagine, so late 1800s, it's almost into 1900, which is almost into the First World War, uh, and in the 20th century. That's incredibly important for understanding the balance of power in Europe during this time period. But we'll get to more of that later. So it helped the European countries, but in a lot of ways, industrialization exploited a lot of other nations, like India, Australia, almost all of Africa, most of South America, parts of the Middle East, and numerous Pacific islands, as in they were made into colonies to obtain the raw materials that all the other industrializing nations needed to fuel their industry, to make into finished goods, to sell back to those people in order to make a profit, to keep good balance of trade, as in sending out more than they're taking in. In terms of value, they might have been taking in more raw materials than they're sending out finished goods, but the raw materials aren't worth as much as the finished goods that they're making. So, I talked earlier about Britain reforming its land use, so it could farm more, essentially. But really, this was most important, though population increase was important, most important for the way that they managed livestock, which is weird to think that livestock helped lead to the Industrial Revolution, but seriously, that's what happened. So, wealthy landowners changed basic laws where they took all these common pastures where the livestock of peasants, people who just lived on the land, would graze, and they turned them into privately owned fields dedicated to large-scale agriculture, especially the production of wool, um, essentially grazing a whole lot of sheep. And Britain became incredibly well known for the amount of wool cloth that it was producing, the amount of not just sheep, but then also industries to turn that wool into cloth. Um, from the peasant side of this, it ruined a lot of them, and it forced them off their land, which pushed them right into the cities. Now, it greatly increased food production and also wool production. Make sure you write that down. Also wool production. So here's a good map of where all this was happening. You can see it happening in the core of England, right here. And by between 1700 and 1850, over 50% of the whole land area of the red bits were enclosed, as in now privately owned, where previously there had been mostly, it's not exactly public land, but it was common land that people of a particular town would own together. And Parliament was really going over the heads of any sort of town government to give away private land to very wealthy people. So, what were the major early industries? Well, you had cotton textiles, which was also wool textiles. But cotton, the place that was coming from was British colonies. And however much wool was helpful in the beginning and sheep and all that, cotton became the sort of king of the textile industry. Iron was really important just because it helped get industry off the ground. Models of how to use factory systems in order to produce a finished good of iron was what led to the more complex system that is used to make steel. Also, iron is incredibly important for making all the machines that make everything else. So iron was an incredibly important early industry. Steel is surprisingly hard to make well in large amounts. You've always seen like steel blades, like if you're talking samurai swords and stuff. Well, that's steel made over a long period of time. You sort of make the basic steel and then you fold it. You like bang it out so that it's a wider piece of steel, and then you fold it over and you fold it over and fold it over to make it strong and also sort of bendy a little bit. That's important to not have it be brittle, but have it be strong. It's a very difficult thing. It has to do with carbon and the way carbon's in there. It's really cool. So basically, here's some of the inventions that led to those industries. The spinning jenny, which was invented by James Hargreaves, was a much faster way of spinning up thread that then could be made into cloth. And it's kind of as simple as that. A lot of these inventions just simplified or mechanized a process so that human beings didn't have to literally do it with their hands or with machines that they handled every little piece of. It could be done mostly on its own, especially when you sync it up so it all kind of happens at the same time. So there's no human error. It's just machines doing it, which is very cool. Like I mentioned earlier, the steam engine, invented by a man named James Watt. Really, he improved on earlier designs, but basically, James Watt made it useful for people mining coal, which allowed them to mine more coal, which made more work for steam engines, which then led to better and better steam engines. It was the beginning of like maybe a steam engine revolution. I don't know. The cotton gin was started by a man or created by a man named Eli Whitney, um, and that's the name that you have to know. We'll talk in class about the name that gets left out of that. I promise. The steel mass production is, like I said before, very complicated. It has to do with carbon. It's really cool. You should ask a chemistry teacher. I am not cool enough to know the answers to these questions. So let's talk about where this is all coming from. It was a time period when most objects that people used, they made in their own homes, or at least were made down the street from them by Billy Sue's mom and her grandmother. You can see here it's primarily women engaging in cottage industries, and that is the mostly from that European model where there were two spheres where men sort of worked out in the field and women worked in the home. This is not true everywhere. It certainly wasn't true of Native Americans. People were at home making their own home goods, like you making your own plates or spinning your own wool at this point. But you didn't just make them by the end of the Middle Ages for your own consumption, but you also made to sell to other people who perhaps couldn't or didn't have the skill to make it themselves. But then the factory system was totally different. It wasn't just you and your family at home making stuff that you could sell. It was some guy who had enough money to get all these machines and hire all these people to make enormous amounts of finished home goods, especially, that then he could sell in the open market, and you would get paid wages, but he was the one making money. But it employed a lot of women and children. And today isn't the day we're going to talk about the effects on labor and society. That'll be for your next homework assignment. But definitely take a look at this picture. You'll see all of these women working in this textile mill. Textile, you can see all of the sort of rolling. I believe it's textile. Yeah, I'm right. Developments in medicine. Now, during this time period, there were a number of really incredibly important developments in science in general, but medicine turns out to be one of the most impressive ones. Now, think for a second. How would you figure out how to prevent a disease? Like, literally, like this is obviously before bacteria. See down there it says Discovery of Bacteria by Louis Pasteur. So before you have any idea that there's these little things that get in you and then multiply and then you die, before that, Edward Jenner noticed that people who worked with cows and like in close proximity to cows seemed to get smallpox less often. And then he noticed that cows had a similar disease that resembled in a lot of ways the smallpox that people would get. Smallpox is this horrible disease. You end up with all these scars on your face. If you survive, it killed off an enormous number of Native Americans. It had been the scourge of Europe for a long time. And he noticed that if, in fact, you were around cows, you were less likely to get it. It's not really practical to just put cows in everyone's houses and kind of like hang out with them. So he managed to isolate some of the disease-causing stuff from cows and put it in people. And then it turns out your body then sees that as a kind of pox and attacks it, and then is better able to defend itself against smallpox. And so later, in the future, this was refined into a process where now that's not really how vaccinations work. They're not live bacteria from animals that have similar diseases. But this was an early attempt at doing that, and it was surprisingly effective. So this is a great development in this time. It helps reduce the suffering from disease in the developed world. The discovery of bacteria was also incredibly important. Now it's no longer demons or something wrong with you or bad air or sins you've been committing. It's these little things that get in you, they multiply, and you die. Transformative in the world of medicine. So this is a whole list of the impacts of the Industrial Revolution. And these impacts are incredibly important for you to remember as we're going through this time period, because you'll start to see these things pop up and you'll begin to understand what exactly caused them, and perhaps get a bit of an experience of what it was like to live as these major changes were happening. So the population runs away with itself. There's an enormous growth of the number of people on Earth as a result of the Industrial Revolution, because they industrialized food production and food distribution, especially. They also, we mentioned the advances in medicine. So you both have more people living because they're not dying from disease and they're not dying from starvation. And you still have a similar number of people being born. And as a result, the population just sort of runs away. Now we've sort of leveled off so that we don't have that many children, even though very few of us die. Also, at this time, there's an increased standard of living. Now, a standard of living generally refers to how much stuff you have, and especially how much access to stuff, like access to food, access to healthcare, access to education, access to political systems. That standard of living increased for some people. For instance, the people who owned businesses, the people who managed to get decent jobs in factories in cities, and people who owned a substantial amount of land. Now, who did it not rise for? The people at the bottom of the totem pole, the urban poor and the rural poor. The rural poor lost a lot of their land. The urban poor were sucked into a system where they were paid very low wages for very difficult work, and their children were forced to work in factories, and so they had very little education, and as a result, they could never escape that status of being a low-wage worker. So, at the same time, you see some people doing really well, there are other people getting sucked into a system of poverty. There was improved transportation. Instead of just having a horse and maybe a carriage on really terrible roads, you had the ability to produce really nice roads, but mostly you were able to travel by water, steamship, or on barges through the new canals, or you were able to travel later in the Industrial Revolution on trains. And near the end of the Industrial Revolution was the development of the car, which improved individual transportation. So I mentioned earlier all the peasants getting pushed off of their land, and at the same time, the development of industrial centers where there were a lot of jobs in a very small area. That led to urbanization, or the development of cities, and especially urbanization means an enormous number of people moving to those cities in order to find work. It also resulted in a lot of environmental pollution because you were burning a lot of coal, you're burning a lot of oil, you are using a lot of your waste products in really irresponsible ways, like dumping them into rivers, for instance. But there was a lot more increased education, in part because there was more education called for because everything was much more complex. Running an industrialized society requires an enormous amount more technical knowledge. And as a result, there are just a lot more jobs that need education, and the education system followed on that. Also because there was just a lot more money, a lot more people were moving into a middle class situation, like it says further down that list. You had more call for education in general. The decline of health and working conditions for the lower class, as I mentioned earlier, not only were they stuck in low-wage jobs that were terrible, they were dangerous. They often forced you to be in contact with a lot of carcinogens, as in stuff that gives you cancer, and also the health of the area in which they lived, as in the buildings where they lived, the streets where they lived, were very dangerous. Finally, there's this growing gap between the rich and poor. This is true in your industrializing countries, but it's also true when you compare the countries that were becoming industrialized and the countries that had remained unindustrialized. They were remaining mostly poor, and the people who picked up industry early on were becoming much richer, much faster. And so that is all for this week. I hope you have enjoyed this fine video presentation.